Do you wish you could get almost like a very practical, quick and dirty guide on how to do better podcast interviews so that not only you're showcasing yourself as an expert on your own show while you're sharing the stage with a guest, but also that you are keeping those listeners tuned in all the way through the interview so it doesn't affect the episode retention rate? And so that's exactly what we're covering in this week's episode of the podcast space. Now, this episode is very special. As it is the last week of March, I decided to combine not only the fact that I am going to be going to Podcast Movement and spending pretty much the whole week in LA, also speaking, which I am a little nervous about. Also, I thought, as it is Women's History Month, why not share the stage with a fellow podcast expert that I respect and I think she is great, to just let her give you the best tips on how to create podcast interviews. And what I love about this training is that you will be able to pinpoint the most common podcast mistakes with clear examples. And so I invited Sarah Heeter, founder of PodFox Media. And as Sarah is a podcast producer and strategist, she comes at it with a very practical side, but also a really kind and coaching side, which I love. So I would love for you to listen all the way till the end, because Sarah is actually providing some additional assets that you will also find on the show notes. And you should absolutely connect with her because she is just so knowledgeable. I think she's wonderful. And so why not connect with her? Now, these podcasts originally aired on Sarah's private client podcast, which I think is a brilliant idea. And so even before we get the episode, 3 things to note. Number 1, you know that I always talk about the importance of collaborating with other creators? This is the example. Number 2, I am repurposing content from someone else's into this show because it just makes sense without burning out. I am turning a necessity into an opportunity to teach you how to better create content, and this is the perfect example. And number 3, I am helping you get to know Sarah, who is an excellent professional. That way, we're strengthening our relationship and cross-promoting our brands, which everybody wins. All right, so without further ado, enjoy this episode, and I'll be back next week with a lot of updates on Podcast Movement. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me for the Elevate Your Interviews Host Unforgettable podcast conversations. We're learning today and we're going to level up. Many people who are listening to this probably already know me, but in case you don't, my name is Sarah Heeter. I am the CEO and founder of PodFox Media, and I am a podcast producer and strategic consultant. I started PodFox back in 2019, though I've been working in podcasting, honestly, since 2016. And since I started PodFox, I have personally produced thousands of episodes at this point and consulted on hundreds of shows, which is really, really wild to say, but it has been just a blast. And I'm excited to see the growth that PodFox is having now so that we can find all kinds of new innovative ways to really support people with this platform of podcasting and audio only content. We're calling it an audio revolution. There is a whole underutilized method of how we can really make an impact. And this is going to impact the world as well as, specifically all these different industries. We're calling it an audio revolution, and I want you to be part of it. So that's what this is for. At PodFox, we are helping change makers strategically launch, grow, and monetize podcasts in order to expand their audience, establish their expertise, and make more money. I think that podcasting is just a great platform for building your own It's a great way to build your own platform and to use your voice, because I truly believe that your voice matters. One of my favorite things about podcasting is that it has such a low barrier to entry. I think that really podcasting is for everyone. Anyone who wants to start a podcast truly can, including interviewing people on their podcast. And any of us can, especially now that pretty much the entire population of at least the United States, but globally, has become very familiar with Zoom in the past 3 years. Truly, we all have access to this technology to interview people, record it, and put it on the internet as a podcast. So really the barrier to entry is so low. With that being said, to truly harness the power of podcasting, there is some strategy that really is very helpful to do it effectively. And one of my other favorite things about the power of podcasting is that it mimics the intimacy of a phone call. And if you work with us at PodFox, if you're one of my lovely clients, you hear me talk about this all the time, the mimicking the intimacy of a phone call. It is so powerful to have that audio only content in somebody's ears. And if you think about the fact that the average podcast is 25 to 45 minutes long and it comes out weekly, how many people in your life do you talk to on the phone for 25 to 45 minutes a week? That number is slim to none. And if you were to talk to someone on the phone that often for that long, they would certainly be a very intimate part of your life. That would be a very intimate connection. But to truly mimic the intimacy of a phone call, we do have to have strategy. So how the heck do we do that? There's really two very key ways to making sure that you are strategically achieving the mimicking the intimacy of a phone call. So number one is you need to know who's on the other end. You need to know who's listening. You wouldn't have a weekly 25 to 45 minute phone call without knowing who you're talking to, right? You need to know who's on the other end. So getting really, really clear on the audience. And the second piece of that is storytelling. If you're talking to somebody on the phone for 25 to 45 minutes, you're essentially, that's a really close relationship. You're sharing stories huge in scope, like this is a traumatic experience I went through as a child, but you're also sharing, hey, this is what happened to me in the Starbucks drive-thru, right? So storytelling really needs to be a part of the conversations that we're having on our podcasts in order to be real people and to achieve that level of intimacy and that level of impact. So the third part here on this slide is effective interviews, and both your clear audience and your storytelling are going to show up in interviews if you are doing them effectively. So let's dig into exactly what does an effective interview look like. This is why you're here, right? So I'm going to start with the most common mistakes that podcasters make when they host interviews. And I want to go ahead and preface this with, these are the most common mistakes. So if you're making them, that's because most people are. In no way am I calling you out or trying to make anyone feel bad. And for my clients who are listening to this, who do this, I want you to know I am not saying you're doing it wrong or you're doing it badly. What I'm saying is we can do it better, right? And almost everybody does this. So it's not just you and it's not me calling you out. So don't get mad. And also, please don't let this hurt your feelings. What we're going to do is say, this is what most interviews sound like, and here's how we can do it even better. Okay, so the first most common mistake is cross-talking and interrupting. And what's really funny about this is especially when we're new to interviewing, most of the time when cross-talking and interrupting happens, it's because we are so excited and enthusiastic about the conversation. We're engaged in the conversation. We've established a really good rapport with the person we're talking to. Sometimes the person we're talking to is even someone we have a close personal relationship with. So it's a friend or it's somebody we've worked with for a long time, and we have a really, really good rapport. So the cross-talking and interrupting happens because we're excited and we're animated and we're engaged in the conversation. But cross-talking and interruptions, that is the number one complaint in negative podcast reviews. So your listener does not want to listen to cross-talking and interruptions. They don't want to listen to it. It is frustrating for the listener experience. And I want to add that because when we're doing it, part of the reason this is so common, it's also how we talk to each other in real life. When you're hanging out with your best friend, when you're hanging out with a family member you're very close to and you're very comfortable with and you're safe with, it's not seen as a sign of disrespect. It's seen as engagement and enthusiasm, right? So just because you're doing that to your guest, you aren't necessarily being rude or disruptive. But to your listener, who then becomes a third party instead of part of the conversation because they're turned off by this, they think, not only do I not want to continue to listen to all the crosstalk and interruptions, but also it deteriorates my trust. It's not that I don't like the person hosting this. It's not that I don't want the content. It's not that I don't think, it's not the audio quality of the technology. It's not that. It's that I now trust this host a little bit less because I perceive it as disrespect to their guest. I want to hear what their guest has to say. And like I said, this is the number one complaint that I see in negative podcast reviews. So what can we do about this? Let's talk about how to fix this. One is for sure practice, just practicing listening without responding. Easier said than done. So I have other tips for you as well. So another tip is to record your podcast conversation on multiple audio tracks. Now, stay with me if you're not techie, because you can do this. If you're using a platform like Zoom, there's actually a checkbox in the settings that you can just check off or tick off, depending on if you're not from the US. You can tick that box, and that is going to actually allow you to record your guest and yourself on multiple tracks. And that's going to make editing a lot easier. If you're not using Zoom, there are alternative platforms like Squadcast or Riverside FM. PodFox, we're using Squadcast. I'm using that with several of my clients. If you are one of my clients listening to this and you want to explore Squadcast, you don't know anything about it yet, we haven't talked about it yet, but you're interested, let's definitely talk about it. But either way, what these platforms do by recording on multiple audio tracks is if visually we're talking over each other like this, then in the editing side, you can actually split it so that one person talks and then the other person responds, which sounds way nicer to listen to. Alternatively, if both points are not important, if we're talking over each other, this person's making the point and this person's laughing or coughing or saying something that doesn't really matter, we can just mute it and take it out, right? And still leave that other one intact, the important one, right? So there's lots of editing options there. So that's a good option. Another trick that I personally use to minimize cross-talking and interruptions when I'm interviewing people on my podcast, I host a podcast for Girl Scout troop leaders called The Troop Leader Experience. And I mute myself while my guest is talking. That prevents me from spending the entire interview going, good point, because I edit my own show and I hate listening to myself doing that back. So I mute myself, and it's really effective because then I'm not interrupting because I'm literally muted. I have to unmute in order to say something, and that really helps practice the skill of intentionally not interrupting. So that's the first one. The second most common mistakes that people make when they are interviewing is getting stuck in lengthy introductions. And there's really two versions of this. One is doing that solo introduction that you record separately, right? And if you listen to podcasts, you've heard people do this. Maybe you've done this on your own show where you have already recorded the interview and you go back and you record a solo clip where you're saying, hey, this is my guest today. This is who they are. This is their bio. And this is what we're going to talk about. Now, that in itself is not inherently a problem. You can do a solo introduction if it makes sense for the structure of your show, and especially if you want to have a moment to speak directly to the listener by yourself. That's totally fine. But just keep it short, keep it snappy, keep it tight, and don't spend too much time telling people all the things you're going to talk about with this guest and then proceed to talk about them with the guest. People will start skipping it. And this is the second most common thing I see show up in negative podcast reviews and critical podcast reviews. Listeners are saying, the first 8 minutes were just telling me what was going to happen in the actual interview. I want to just hear the actual interview. So short, snappy, to the point. Not my forte. So I get it. It's not always easy. Okay. And then the second part of this lengthy introduction, and this one, I literally cannot tell you how common this is. Pretty much every single person who is new to interviewing starts this way. They start out with the very first question. Tell me about yourself. What do you do? What's your story? And then that person on the receiving end might have a really concise answer because they're a really practiced interviewee, but most likely they are going to drone on and on and on and on and on and tell you their entire life story, their entire work story before you even get to quote unquote the point of the actual interview. Like, why are they even here? Why are they relevant to your guests? What were you hoping for them to actually achieve in this conversation for your podcast? So we can actually, this might feel uncomfortable, but we can actually literally just skip this. So for one, you probably have this person's bio in your show notes in some form. You probably have some version of their bio in the show notes. For two, it's such weird grammar, but number two, you also may have done a pre-interview introduction like we were just talking about, where you gave their bio. So there's no need to give their bio again. You already gave it. Even if you don't have one of those solo introductions, which is totally fine. I don't like doing them, but some people really do love them. There's not a wrong way to do that. But even if you don't have that, if the person you're interviewing has a website and social media, their bio is literally all over the internet. It's everywhere. And the final point that I really want to make about this of like, your listener can get their bio anywhere they want, is if this person has given a podcast interview ever before, they've been asked this question. And one of the major benefits of hosting interviews, of having interview guests on your podcast, is that people who are fans from their audience, people who love them, people who are searching for them and for their content, they're going to find your podcast. But if they're their fan and they're their audience and you want them to discover you and your show and what you do, then you don't want to spend the first half of the interview talking about who is this person, because the people you're trying to attract into your audience already have that information. So hopefully that all makes sense. So those are all reasons why we can skip that question altogether. So my recommendations for an alternative, because I know it can be really uncomfortable for like, how do I start then? So here's what you're going to do. You're going to greet the guest. You're going to thank them for coming. You're going to say, this is either how we know each other or how we're connected or what this person's role or title is, whatever makes the most sense in context. And then you're going to say, I'm really excited to talk to you today because I want to talk about subject, right? Like, get into the subject. We want to go straight into the meat of the interview. So skip the bio. Okay. So we have cross-talking and interruptions, really common mistake. We have lengthy introductions, really common mistake. The next one that I see is forgetting to keep yourself in the seat of you are the expert. And what I really want to emphasize here, and again, some of my clients have heard me say this a lot, but your podcast is your house. And the person who is being interviewed is a guest in your house. You can't forget that when you're doing the interview, because we have a tendency to defer to the guest. I want to honor the guest. I want to honor the guest's story. I want to honor the guest's expertise. And I'm not saying to dishonor them or disrespect them or disregard that. Of course, you wouldn't disregard a guest in your house. You wouldn't be rude to a guest in your house. But I am saying there's a certain level of mutual respect that should occur that puts you in the driver's seat. This is your guest. This is your audience. This is your podcast. This is your house. So trying to keep that top of mind. And again, the best way to do this here is practice. This is a hard one. Those other two, we've got some great, easy tips for how to work on those things, right? How to up-level this. This next one, it really just takes practice and keeping it top of mind. So you are the expert on your own content. You are the expert on your own mission, and you are the expert on your own audience. So keep that top of mind when you're interviewing a guest. They are a guest expert. So practicing making connections of, you said this, and I know the person listening is feeling this. I know the person listening is experiencing this. When you say this that you just said, repeating back, when you say this is why this is so important to my listener. This is why this is so important to my community. And this is why this is relevant to us. This is what I want the person listening to take away from that. And I do this all the time on my Troop Leader podcast. I'll bring in a guest expert who isn't part of the Girl Scout community, may not even know a lot about Girl Scouts, but they're sharing whatever they know about, children's health or, bullying or whatever developmental thing, outdoor skills. And I will, in the midst of an interview, I will say, and to you listening, I want you to really hear that point they just made. Let me connect that back to the mission of what we're doing here, right? This is what I know your core values are because you're my people. So let me reiterate, you just heard my guest say this, right? And this is why this matters. You're bringing the listener into the conversation and you're reminding them, I'm the expert here. This is my house. Okay. This podcast is my house. All right. So cross-talking and interrupting, lengthy introductions, forgetting to be the expert. And then the fourth most common mistake that I want to talk about, and I hear this so often on the editing side, and take it out, you're welcome, is spoon feeding answers. You probably already have an idea of what you want your guest to talk about and what you hope they will say when they come on the podcast. And it can be really tempting to ask a question and then tell them what they're supposed to answer instead of just letting them answer. So here's an example. So what kind of ice cream do you like? Do you like chocolate? Do you like vanilla? You seem like you would probably really like, an out of the box flavor, like, I'm spacing, guys. Rocky Road's not that out of the box. I don't know. Why am I having trouble with ice cream flavors right now? But you get my point. And also I'm sensing a theme, spoon feeding ice cream, but that's okay. I like food. It is what it is. So anyways, so you're spoon feeding your guests the answer. And most of the time, of course, it's not going to be about ice cream, right? It's going to be about something more substantial, but you're asking them, how did it feel when you experienced this? Did you feel this? Did you feel this? No, just let them tell you what they were feeling, right? So you're inviting them on, hopefully, because you genuinely want to hear what they have to say. Also, your audience really wants to hear what they have to say. So try to think of it as, if you're tempted to spoon feed the answer, you probably don't actually need to ask that question. You already know the answer. Instead, you can actually say, and I know that this happened, or I know that this is part of your story, or I know this is part of what you do. So, or I know in my case with the Troop Leader experience, if I'm interviewing someone about, outdoors, why the outdoors is important for girls, right? I might say, I know that being outdoors is important for girls because the research shows us X, Y, and Z. I don't need my guest to tell me that, and my audience doesn't need my guest to tell them that. We already know that. So I can establish it and say, we know this. And then I'm going to ask a deeper question. You get, presumably, 25 to 45 minutes. Maybe you scheduled an hour. You get an hour of this person's time. what do you want to know? What does your audience want to know? If you already know the answer, you don't need to ask the question. Instead, spend that precious time asking the questions you genuinely want to know. So these are the 4 most common mistakes, and those are some of my tips around how to counterbalance those mistakes. The guide has so much good stuff in it. I'm actually really proud of this resource. It's one of my best so far, and I've got some pretty good resources. So if you haven't checked out that content library on podfoxmedia.com, you definitely should check it out. And if you are a client of mine, keep in mind, every resource that we create in PodFox is yours. You will always get them. It includes a workflow. So I want to have guests. How do I do it? Right? From start to finish, how you find them, how you pitch them, how you book time with them, what communication to send before the interview, what's going to happen at the time of the interview, and then what happens after the interview. You get a full workflow. You're also going to get sample questions for any industry. So no matter what your podcast is about, I'm giving you a list of questions to use as a jumping off point. Some of them you'll be able to use directly, and some of them you might have to tailor so that they're even more effective. And they hopefully will give you 1,000 ideas of other questions that you could ask, especially pertaining to the specific guest or their expertise that when they come on. We're also, as I mentioned, talking about how to find and pitch guests. So I've been doing that podcast for troop leaders for 5 years. And frankly, there's not that many troop leaders. So in the grand scheme of niches, that's a very, very niche. It's a very niche podcast. So where the heck do you find guests? And if there's somebody you really, really want to interview, how do you pitch them? How do you ask them to come on your podcast? Because the reality is that the Oprahs, the Hillary Clintons, the celebrity of the month, the hot celebrity of the month, they all do podcast interviews. I just saw this morning a TikTok of a recording of Taylor Swift doing a podcast interview. Literally everyone does podcast interviews at some point, which means you could potentially interview anyone who's alive, right? So how do we pitch those guests, especially if there are dream guests? So that's all in this guide. And I'm actually literally giving you an invitation template that you can just fill in the different sections, the different name, podcast name, expertise, and you can go ahead and just swipe that directly if you would like. So lots and lots of stuff there. There's best practices for those things, as well as actual swipe files and room for brainstorming and a worksheet. So it's a really, really good guide. I do have a lot of other topics that I'm really excited to share with you. And there's lots of ways you can get access to these trainings. If you are a PodFox production client, if we produce your podcast, you are always invited. You are always included. We also do make these available to any podcaster, even if you aren't using us for production. So if you're not getting this kind of strategy from your editor or your podcast manager, or if you're DIYing, come get strategy from us. That's cool. We want to help you have an effective podcast. We want to help you use your voice. So if you're listening to this and you want to share it with another podcaster who maybe does their own thing, or they work with a different producer, please do share. They are available for purchase just one at a time. If there's a specific topic that you want to attend, we do also have a membership called the Audio Revolution. And the membership includes all of our resources and all of our trainings. So you get access to all of those strategy pieces that our podcast production clients get access to. You just aren't getting the podcast production or the individual coaching sessions. So we do have a membership available for you as well, called the Audio Revolution. And that includes these trainings. But all right. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your support. And when I started this by saying, I believe that podcasting is an opportunity to build your own platform and use your voice because your voice matters, I want you to hear that last part. Your voice matters. The work that you're doing matters. And there are people who need to hear it. And I hope this was helpful.